This is a story of light and darkness, and a painter called Joseph Wright. He was fascinated by light in all its forms. Moonlight, lamplight, the colours of a rainbow, the glow of a forge. But the works for which he is most famous are of a very different sort of light, the light of knowledge. They are intriguing, enigmatic images which, when decoded, give us a unique insight into a period of history called the Enlightenment. They show a society at the crossroads, fascinated by the possibilities of science, but worried about losing its soul. Room 34 in the National Gallery contains the cream of British art. Constable's Haywain, Stubbs's fabulous whistle jacket, and Turner's Fighting Temeraire, recently voted the greatest painting in Britain. But if you stay here for long enough, you begin to notice something odd. The painting which seems to get most of the attention is not one of these famous masterpieces, but a canvas by an artist who until fairly recently was dismissed by much of the British art world as a minor provincial. Joseph Wright of Derby. This is one of the most extraordinary and intriguing British paintings of the 18th century. It's a work of real artistic showmanship, enormous in scale, yet almost photographic in detail. The entire scene is illuminated by a single source of light, a candle, while a glimpse of moonlight adds a sense of mystery. Critics might call it showy to the point of melodramatic, but it's still totally arresting. When you first see it, it's like stumbling in on some occult Masonic ritual. The pedantically descriptive title is An Experiment on a Bird in the Air Pump. But that raises more questions than it answers. What sort of experiment? What on earth are they doing to that bird? Why are those children crying? And why is this old man sitting in the corner, apparently oblivious to what's going on? And what are these strange objects scattered across the table? The answers to these questions, it turns out, take us into a world even more extraordinary than the one the painting depicts, a world reveling in the new scientific ideas of what came to be known as the Enlightenment, but also beginning to discover some of the philosophical terrors that lurked in the shadows. The story of this epic painting begins far away from metropolitan London, in Derbyshire. Joseph Wright was born in 1734 in the city that would become part of his name. Derby was then in a state of flux, a small but energetic provincial town that boasted one of the world's first modern factories, this water-powered silk mill. The son of a lawyer, he grew up among a group of forward-thinking craftsmen and professionals who were eager to embrace new technologies and all the new ideas of the Enlightenment. From an early age, Wright showed himself to be a prodigiously talented painter. After 3 years at a leading art academy, he began a career as a portrait painter, travelling the country painting members of the landed gentry. He was very good at it and could have made a handsome living out of portraiture. But Joseph Wright found himself drawn in a different direction. Here he is in his mid-30s, a technical virtuoso at the height of his powers, confident enough to paint himself as the English Rembrandt. We see a man of bravado but tinged with melancholy and capable of capturing both qualities with enormous skill. But what makes his self-portrait really interesting is the story that lies behind it. It's on the back of this picture that its extraordinary hidden secrets revealed. It's a detailed sketch of the air pump picture. All the main components are here. There's the air pump, the pensive old man, the tearful children, the bird trapped in a glass jar. So what led a portrait painter from Derby to a subject like this? An answer to that question can be found here at Soho House in Birmingham, the home of the great industrialist Matthew Boulton. It was here that a group of philosophers, writers and inventors began to attend regular meetings held at the full moon to discuss new scientific ideas. They became known as the Lunar Society, and the man who emerged as their unofficial court painter was Joseph Wright. This is his portrait of John Whitehurst, a clockmaker from Derby, a brilliant geologist and a lifelong friend of Joseph Wright. This is Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, a gifted botanist and doctor. Other lunatics, as they called themselves, included Josiah Wedgwood, the world-famous potter, Joseph Priestley, the discoverer of oxygen, James Watt, the steam engine pioneer. They were a truly extraordinary group, epitomising the spirit of inquiry which so characterised their era. True men of the Enlightenment.
The Lunar Society sums up the enormous excitement about the potential of science. It's ordinary people, it's the provinces, it's not the institutions, it's a sense that everything is possible. And that there is a sort of glorious excitement in pursuing discoveries and experiments to their end. Experiment is, in a way, a sort of gentlemanly pursuit. I mean, it's serious, but it's rather like collecting flowers or fishing. You might just be a person who has a passion for small electrical experiments, so you get your own electrical machine and you have fun at home. It's very much before the days of specialism and before the days of institutions and before the days of universities. So people with common interests gathered in this kind of club. They would often meet in an evening, they'd have a big meal, they'd then clear the table and out would come, their papers or their experiment books or the latest things that they've been working on. There are letters, for example, from James Watt saying, you must come next week. We have a new electrical machine. Or Mr. Priestley has been making experiments on air, he says, in his usual manner of grouping about.
The core belief of the Enlightenment was that rational inquiry would transform the world. Though Wright was never formally a member, the Lunar Society provided him with friends, patrons and inspiration.
He is a young Midlands man who shares this very common fascination with mechanics, with light, with the new scientific knowledge. He also intimately knew different members, which is how he gets pulled in. And he would ask them about equipment and about experiments.
This was the high point of the so-called Age of Enlightenment, and everyone, from a manufacturer like Matthew Boulton to an artist like Joseph Wright, could be a part of it. It wasn't long before the portrait painter from Derby was starting to make a name for himself with a very different kind of work. This is Joseph Wright's first scientific painting. a dramatic rendition of a public astronomy lecture. In the early 1760s, lectures like this were regularly held in Derby, and Wright may have attended one. Some critics have even suggested that this is Joseph Wright himself, on the right-hand side of the painting. As always, the title is ponderous. He called it a philosopher giving that lecture on the Orrery, in which a lamp is put in place of the sun. Dominating the scene is the philosopher. The term scientist hadn't yet been invented. He's a man worthy of the title, wise, sombre, his every word being taken down by a devout disciple. His audience has become lost in his universe, which he's trying to explain with this marvellous contraption. It's a clockwork model of the solar system. It's called an orrery. The grand orrery at the centre of Wright's painting was one of the scientific marvels of the age. A beautiful machine, purpose-built to disseminate knowledge. Astronomers from previous generations used armillary spheres like this to show off the old vision of the universe, in which the Earth was at the centre of the solar system. This idea was shattered by the work of Copernicus, Galileo and Newton, who understood that the Earth was not at the centre. The Sun was.
The main thing the orrery does is it lets you see the planets revolving around the sun. You have the sun, this brass globe in the centre, and as I turn the handle, you can see the inner planets, Mercury and Venus, moving relatively quickly around. And then out here, we've got the Earth and the Moon, a bit slower. They're being caught up on. There's Mercury racing round. And as you go further out, the other planets take much longer to complete their orbits. This was being made at a time when there was a movement, a sense that you had to communicate science to a much wider audience, a more middling sort of audience. And that gave you a need for devices that could really show you the way the world worked in a very direct, visible way.
Orrery is a rather unusual name. Where did it come from?
Well, the name Orrery comes from a person. It's the Earl of Orrery, an early 18th century figure, a learned nobleman, someone who wanted to understand the new science. So the name comes not from the inventor, not from the maker, but from a patron, someone who commissioned one of the first of these sorts of devices.
Joseph Wright's very specific in the painting that the sun has been replaced by a lamp. Why do you think that was?
It lets you very vividly demonstrate how the sun's light gives you eclipses, how the planets cast shadows. And this one could do the same thing. You can undo the sun, you can unscrew it here, take it all the way off, put a lamp in place, and then in all the textbooks they say at that moment, close the shutters, darken the room, and then you will see the light of the sun illuminating the planets, and you will see the phenomena of eclipses. You will see how day turns to night as the Earth turns.
When people saw this marvellous machine being used, what sort of reactions do you think it got?
I think the main one would just be of astonishment, both at our place in the universe, a small planet going round the sun, but also one of wonder. Here are things organised machine-like by clockwork. They keep regular periods as the planets go around the sun. It's one of enlightenment, understanding the way the world is and the way the world works. I think that's the primary thing, of just understanding by sight.
Early orreries were so expensive that very few were made, but as the 18th century progressed, they became more widely available in all shapes and sizes. In an article for The Englishman in 1713, the famous essayist Richard Steele proclaimed that an orrery was as vital to every good household as a clock, because it made astronomy accessible and promoted the art of elegant conversation. Orreries were initially status symbols, used in portraits to signify the wealth and learning of rich noblemen. But by the time Joseph Wright conceived his painting, their meaning had changed. He shows how orreries had become part of the world of the emerging middle classes.
Wright was attuned, I think, to themes and topics which were of interest to his potential, the buyers of his pictures or his patrons, and science was one of those themes. I think what's interesting is that this is a domestic setting for science. This is not a laboratory, or it's not a lecture at the Royal Institution, which was a very male institution. This is a very domestic scene. We have children here, wonderful portrait of a brother and sister, with the sister herself telling him what's going on, as the philosopher tells the others what's going on. To the left, rather serious, solemn figure of a woman here with a hand sort of hidden away, and the suggestion is she may actually be working the apparatus that's moving the planets, making the world go round. The figure above has the kind of image and authority of a kind of Newton figure. There is a sort of resemblance to Newton. What's interesting about Wright is that he would choose to do an oil painting of this subject. You would have seen at least images of apparatus like this in prints, scientific journals, that kind of thing. But what's remarkable about this picture is the way that Wright, as it were, raised the status of this to make it a grand oil painting with clearly, and you can tell by the expressions on their faces, an aspect of seriousness, solemnity, of meditating on serious subject matter, which is really only found in large oil paintings like this. Wright was known as the painter of light. The gathering of figures around a light source is a feature of many of his paintings, not just the scientific ones. The brass ball on the orrery has been replaced by an oil lamp, which you can see reflected here with a wick in it and a candle flame. And that is the source of light for the entire picture. But also, of course, light in the 18th century is a great metaphor for the Enlightenment itself.
Wright's eulogy to the orrery was a huge success. It earned him the princely sum of £210 and was widely reproduced as an engraving. One contemporary critic nicknamed him Orrery Wright. It is easy to see Wright's painting as a celebration of Enlightenment learning. Happy smiling children, a patrician lecturer, an intense young man. But elsewhere in the painting, you see hints of a different agenda. Particularly odd are the two characters either side of the orrery. They look strangely blank, as if they can't quite cope. Is this really the face of the Enlightenment? This sense of questioning the new science comes to the fore in An Experiment on a Bird in the Air Pump, which he unveiled 2 years later. In some ways it looks like the orrery. Both paintings feature scientists holding court over a piece of equipment whilst the public looks on. You almost feel as if you could swap a few characters without anyone noticing. The tone of Wright's second scientific painting, though, is much darker. The air pump at its centre is one of the most iconic instruments of the scientific Enlightenment, and one of the most controversial. Its long and complex history began with a series of experiments carried out in the 17th century to investigate that fundamental substance, air. Today we know that air can be compressed and expanded, that it's made up of gases such as oxygen and nitrogen, that it has weight and exerts pressure. But at the beginning of the Enlightenment, none of this was known. There was no understanding of respiration or combustion, and the idea that you could have a vacuum, a space without air, was heresy. Then, in 1643, Evangelista Torricelli, one of Galileo's assistants, devised a simple but controversial experiment, which he claimed proved that a vacuum could exist. It involved nothing more than a sealed glass tube and a quantity of mercury. me about the Torricelli experiment.
Torricelli experiment consists of taking a tube, a glass tube like this one, perhaps about a metre long, filling it with mercury right to the top, placing a finger over the top, inverting that, allowing nothing to come into that tube, and then I place the bottom of the open end of the tube into this dish of mercury like so. And if you focus on what happens at the top of the tube as I release my finger, you can see that the level of the mercury gradually drops.
To the consternation of everyone who saw the experiment and all those who repeated it, as the level of mercury fell, it left an empty space behind.
The controversy was that what could possibly be left in that space? Clearly nothing could have entered, mercury left, so therefore it could only leave nothing, a void behind, or a vacuum. And a vacuum, or the creation of a vacuum, was rather heretical to the church. They didn't see the sense in God creating nothingness. And so therefore the existence of a vacuum is thought to be abhorrent.
This experiment split Europe's emerging scientific community. So-called vacuists backed Torricelli's claim, whilst others insisted that a vacuum was simply impossible. At Magdeburg in Germany, the controversy took an unexpected twist. It all started with this man, Otto von Guericke. In 1631, during the 30 Years' War, von Guericke's home city was burned to the ground by Catholic forces, killing as many as 20,000 people. When he later became mayor of the city, one of his first acts was to order the deployment of these fire pumps throughout the city. Von Guericke's genius was to realise what may now seem obvious, that a pump that could squirt water at flames could suck air out of a vessel and create a vacuum. This led him to build a series of air pumps, each one more elaborate, more bizarre looking, but more effective than the last. They all had one purpose only: scientific research. In 1650, von Guericke embarked on a series of groundbreaking experiments on the properties of air and vacuums. He tried to weigh air. He created a prototype air rifle. And he investigated the force of atmospheric pressure. Von Guericke's fame was sealed in 1663 when he staged one of the most famous experiments in the history of science in front of the German Emperor Ferdinand III. His aim was to use his vacuum pump to demonstrate the immense but invisible power of air pressure, and to do so in the most public and dramatic fashion possible. It proves to be such a hit, it's been reenacted ever since. He put two copper hemispheres together and sealed them with grease. Then, with his air pump, he sucked out all the intervening air and ordered two teams of horses to try and pull them apart.
Lasst uns das Experiment beginnen. Hubert, Oberstallmeister, übernimmt das Kommando.
Alles fertig, Pferde stramm machen und...
He certainly knew how to put on a show. Von Guericke would pile on the pressure by bringing on more horses. First 4, 8, 16, as many as 30.
Und jetzt schwebt sie, ja!
To everyone's amazement, no matter how many horses were attached, the air pressure on the outside and the vacuum on the inside kept the hemispheres resolutely stuck together. Until finally, after much straining and pushing, he would call proceedings to a halt and release the vacuum. At the climax of the experiment, Von Guericke would show that what the horses had failed to do, he could achieve with a mere twist of a valve. And a couple of assistants. Oh, and so with a flourish, he demonstrated not only the strength of the vacuum, but the power of experimental science to reveal the secrets of the universe. In a tiny, almost invisible detail in Wright's painting, we see a reference to Otto von Guericke's landmark experiment. These are miniature Magdeburg spheres, discarded on the table as though they'd been used as part of the experiment. But when we look at the air pump itself, we see that it's of a totally different design to the adapted fire extinguishers used by von Guericke. It's very similar, though, to a piece of antique apparatus that you can find at the Royal Society in London. This is an English double-barrelled air pump. It was a much-copied design and would have been in use when Joseph Wright painted his picture. This type of pump was more efficient than von Guericke's and, crucially, was built in such a way that experiments could take place within a glass receiver on top of the pump. Its designer was Francis Hawksby, an early fellow of the Royal Society. This eminent scientific body was one of the key institutions of the early Enlightenment. Today it inhabits a splendid marble palace on the Mall, but when the Royal Society was founded in 1660, its members were philosophical radicals who jokingly referred to themselves as an invisible college because they had no formal home. Their motto said it all, nullius in verba, take no one's word for it. If you want the truth, then you'll have to discover it for yourself. From the very beginning, this meant building instruments, staging experiments, and publishing results. And one of the first devices to demonstrate the power of this approach was the air pump.
What the air pump stood for was the capacity to unlock nature's mysteries by artificial manipulation. And not only that, but that these artificial manipulations going on inside the receiver could be shown to an audience. Experiment was theatre, and the air pump became one of the main stage machines, I think, of the new science. The genius of this machine is that it allows you to find out why the air matters by getting rid of the air. That was what was new. Now, there's something sort of fundamental there, I think, about experimental method. If you're interested in what a substance does, get rid of it and then see what happens. That's what this machine does. Robert Boyle, one of the sponsors of air pumps, said that if he'd been able to do experiments on the moon, it would have been better, but since we can't get to the moon, this will have to do.
Boyle was one of the founders of the Royal Society and one of the most celebrated scientists of the 17th century.
Robert Boyle was fabulously wealthy, a young aristocrat when he began his work in natural philosophy. He was very much one of the prime movers of the new philosophy of the Royal Society, not just financially, but also, I think, philosophically. He gave the programme a philosophical coherence, a literary and practical style, and a public face.
In the late 1650s, Boyle embarked on a series of experiments that would bring him fame and notoriety. His aim was to use the air pump to discover the role of respiration. Why do creatures breathe? Was it a form of ventilation, a way of cooling the heart, as was commonly believed? Or was it to do with some vital element in the air, as some now argued? There was only one way to find out: to see what happens when you put a creature in a vacuum. And so, one day in 1659, he and his assistant took a small bird like this one and placed it in the receiving jar of his air pump. Now, we're not going to literally repeat this, but in order to understand Boyle's experiments and Joseph Wright's painting, you need to know what happened next, when they started to suck out the air. The pump was diligently plied, and the bird for a while appeared lively enough. But upon greater excursion of the air, she began manifestly to droop and appear sick, and very soon after was taken with violent and irregular convulsions. For the bird threw herself over and over 2 or 3 times and died. Boyle called the death of the bird a tragedy, but he was so surprised and intrigued by what he had discovered, he had to go on. So he caught a mouse. Would it, he wondered, survive longer without air, because it was used to living in confined spaces? After a few minutes, the mouse appeared to fall down dead. But when Boyle let the air back in, it was magically revived.
What Robert Boyle and his collaborators were able to show was that the process of extinction and resuscitation of an animal corresponds rather closely to the process that happens if you put a candle in there. If you put a candle there and you light the candle and you gradually take the air out, the flame goes almost completely out. If you leave a little spark at the end of the candle, you can then bring it back to life by bringing the air back in. Whatever it is in the air that keeps animals alive keeps flame going as well. And they called this the aerial niter, the active principle put into the air at creation by God that keeps humans alive and flames burning.
The next stage in his research was to find out what occurred when you deprived a whole range of creatures of this mysterious aerial niter. What would happen, he wondered, if you took a small kitten and put it in the receiving jar? Would a baby animal survive longer because it wasn't yet used to breathing? Yes, he found kittens seemed to last 3 times longer than fully grown animals of the same size. And what about a snake? If breathing really was to cool the heart, what effect would a vacuum have on a cold-blooded creature? He put a caterpillar in. Did size matter?
What we see with Robert Boyle is a really systematic attempt to produce an entire experimental history of respiration and circulation. And that meant the systematic extinction of large numbers of animals and birds. One should think really of Boyle's workshop, Boyle's laboratory, as a kind of costly, ghastly kitchen.
More than 12 species were put into the air pump. Some of the creatures were revived by letting in the air, and some of the survivors were set free by Boyle. But his scientific curiosity overcame any feelings of pity. It's clear that Boyle's work is a key reference point for this painting. But Wright has added a new dimension, moving forward a century to a time when performing such experiments was no longer about science, but spectacle. The man carrying out this experiment is no eminent member of the Royal Society. He's of a very different species, one commonly to be found roaming the roads of Britain in the late 18th century, the scientific showman. These were the tools of his trade: microscopes, telescopes, whirling tubes to demonstrate centrifugal forces, electric chimes that could play a tune, model Archimedean screws, anything to show off the magic of science.
They weren't showing new science, if you like. They weren't actually scientists in the way that we would know them today, i.e. making discoveries. They were demonstrating known pieces of knowledge.
So give us an idea of what sort of event it was when they turned up and put on one of their demonstrations.
Well, they'd advertise their lectures, which was normally a course of lectures, and they would normally be held in coffee houses or rooms. They were for what we now call the middle classes, bourgeoisie. They were quite expensive. They were for ladies or gentlemen, and sometimes there were separate sessions for ladies in particular. They had to be fairly spectacular experiments. Obviously, you had to draw the crowd. None of it was so difficult that your average person couldn't understand it, which obviously with specialisation these days, the situation's changed completely.
What prompted this sort of surge of interest in these scientific lectures?
Well, firstly, the knowledge was quite useful to people, particularly if you were a small landowner. It was about pumping water out of mines. It was about diving bells retrieving loot from the bottom of the sea. Or it was about the design of carts, cart wheels, milling engines, machinery, this sort of thing. Also, people liked to be improved in those days. This was very much part of the Enlightenment mindset, that you had to improve yourself and learn about nature around you.
The most ambitious lecturers would tour Britain with wagon loads of equipment and models of the engineering wonders of Europe. But the real showstoppers of these demonstrations were invariably experiments using the air pump.
These are more pieces of apparatus for the air pump. This is a very well-known experiment called Bell in Vacuo, which shows that sound can't travel without air. So what the lecturer would have done is set the clockwork bell going in ordinary atmospheric pressure, and then evacuate the receiver using the air pump, and gradually the sound gets quieter and quieter until it fades away just about completely.
And these little bottles over here?
These were quite a spectacular experiment. Normally they would have been put in a sort of cage. When you evacuate the air out of the air pump, they actually explode.
I'm particularly intrigued by this object in the middle here. What was that for?
Well, this is known as a lungs glass, and it avoided having to use animals in experiments. What you have in the middle here is a bladder. It's probably a pig's bladder. And this little receiver was put over the air pump. And if you evacuated the air from it, the bladder would expand. And then if you put the air back, the bladder would contract, and you could keep doing this to imitate the action of breathing.
In Wright's painting, however, his lecturer chooses not to use a lungs glass. Like any good showman, he knows that the best demonstrations require an element of real jeopardy. He has no qualms about repeating Boyle's experiments, and does so in the most vivid way possible. He takes the household's much-loved pet cockatoo and places it in the receiving jar. He then begins to pump out the air. As the bird begins to suffocate, it slumps to the bottom of the airless chamber. And it's at this critical moment that Wright freezes the action. What this reveals is that the subject of this experiment isn't the bird after all. It's the spectators. With almost scientific precision, he delineates the reactions of each one. This young man is goggle-eyed. He can't get enough of the poor creature's dying agonies. His companion, on the other hand, adopts a more serious pose, holding his watch so that he can time exactly how long it takes for the bird to die. Meanwhile, on the opposite side, a completely different scene is unfolding. This must be the master of the house, urging his older daughter to carry on watching. He clearly thinks that it'll be good for her, but he also can't quite hide his frustration that by covering her eyes at this critical moment, the money spent not only on an exotic pet, but on the lecturer's hefty fee will be wasted. And then there's the lecturer himself. He pays no attention to the girls, but stares straight out of the painting at us. He holds one hand on the valve that will determine the bird's fate. If he opens it, the air will rush back in and the bird will live. If it remains closed, the bird will surely die. And with the other hand, he gestures out, challenging us to react. What do you think? Do you find the whole idea of the bird's imminent demise distressing, like the girls? Are you fascinated, like the young men? Or are you indifferent, like the two lovers, who seem more interested in procreation than respiration? Wright's painting reflected an increasingly passionate debate over animal experimentation, which had built up during the 18th century. At the beginning of the Enlightenment, there were fewer worries. One of the most influential thinkers of the time, René Descartes, the high priest of rationality, went as far as to argue that animals felt no pain.
Descartes believed that animals were essentially machines. They were automata. They might appear to have feelings, but in fact this was an illusion, that this was just a kind of automatic reaction to the stimulus. Therefore, the way that one treated animals would be looked at in a different light.
Robert Boyle didn't go as far as Descartes, but he had few qualms about putting birds into his air pump.
He thought that the end justified the means, that the only way one could find out about the marvels of God's creation was through this kind of empirical method, by investigating nature. And therefore, although it entails some sacrifice of the animals concerned, that this was legitimate. And after all, the Bible had taught that God had given man dominion over all the animals. So it followed that they were put here for man's use.
A century later, and Boyle's reputation was under attack. He was compared in print to a sadistic Roman emperor.
Even in the very early 18th century, there are many instances of people saying that vivisection and particularly experiments with the air pump were abominably cruel and shouldn't be countenanced at all. Bernard Mandeville, who wrote a famous satire, political satire, The Fable of the Bees, said anyone with any common sense looking at an animal in pain realises that it suffers as we would suffer in the same situation.
In An Experiment on a Bird in the Air Pump, the bird's distress serves to polarise the spectators.
I think that as one sees in Wright's picture, there was a kind of antithesis between the masculine ideal of rationality, the inquiring spirit, which one sees in the attention of the men on the left of the picture, and the cult of sensibility, the idea that tenderness and pity for other human beings and for animals is something praiseworthy in itself, so that the one is offset against the other.
In a series of prints published in the decade before Wright's air pump, Hogarth, the famous satirist, had tried to raise public awareness of animal abuse. The 4 stages of cruelty told the story of Tom Nero, a boy from the workhouse. In stage 1, he is shown torturing a dog. In stage 2, several years later, he's become a coachman who happily beats his horse. In stage 3, we see the effects of this on his character. He murders his lover.
I think that Hogarth, who was a great animal lover, disliked that kind of cruelty to animals, the sort of cruelty he could see around him in the street every day. He disliked it in itself, but what he tried to show in that series of prints is that those who become habitually cruel to animals, who are hardened to cruelty as children, will go on to commit crimes and cruelties against fellow humans. Tom Nero becomes a thief and a murderer and ends up on the surgeon's couch himself, being dissected as an animal might have been. Certainly by the 19th century, Hogarth's series was quoted. It was even quoted in debates in Parliament on the dire effects of allowing cruelty to take place.
Opponents of vivisection took Hogarth's argument a stage further, claiming that anatomists who inflict pain on animals become indifferent to human suffering.
I think there's a central paradox, isn't there, in vivisection, then and now, that the experiments are premised on the idea that animals are like us, sufficiently like us that something that holds true of an animal will also hold true of the human race. And yet the very fact that they are like us suggests that man is not justified in using them merely as disposable objects.
But Wright's painting is no simple Hogarthian morality tale. He's chosen this subject not just to question animal experimentation, but subtly to question the Enlightenment itself. In going from the original sketch to the final painting, Wright has made some telling alterations. The bird has been changed into an exotic cockatoo, then a rare and expensive species. The lecturer has been transformed from a demure turbaned figure seen in profile into a prototypical mad scientist who stares out of the canvas provocatively, and the whole mood has darkened. These genteel members of the middle class have come to the lecture to hear about the scientific laws of nature, but find themselves in a much less predictable environment. They're surrounded by strange, suggestive shapes and shadows. A real sense of menace hangs over the scene. The full moon in the corner casts a cold, baleful light. In the gloom behind the lecturer, we can just see the stone lintel of a doorway leading into darkness, but it looks more like the entrance to a mausoleum than a drawing room. There's one character who seems to embody this apprehensive mood. It's the old man sitting in the corner. It's easy to miss him. He's so still in the midst of all this drama. He shows absolutely no interest in what's going on around him. He's got spectacles but can't be bothered to put them on. Instead, he stares in blank contemplation at perhaps the most mysterious object in the entire scene. It's a jar containing what looks like a biological specimen suspended in preserving fluid. Though Wright took enormous care and precision in painting it, scholars have argued for decades about what it is. Some say that it's a skull, others that it's a dissected lung. Whatever it is, its importance lies less in what it shows than what it conceals. The source of illumination, a candle just visible on the inside of the bowl. Everything we see in the painting is illuminated by it, but Wright emphasizes its transitory nature by placing it next to a pair of candle snuffers. This is not the glowing lamp at the center of the orrery, standing in for the eternal sun, but rather a flickering flame hidden behind a murky bowl, which, like the birds, could be snuffed out at any minute. It illuminates the scene, but it does not enlighten. But in the third of his scientific paintings, exhibited 3 years later, Wright reveals a very different image of enlightenment. The title of this picture is the longest yet. He called it, deep breath, "The Alchemist, in search of the philosopher's stone, discovers phosphorus and prays for the successful conclusion of his operation, as was the custom of the ancient chemical astrologers." The alchemist of the title looks more like an Old Testament prophet than a scientist. And with its vaulted ceiling and leaded windows, the setting looks more like a chapel than a laboratory. This isn't a picture about an orderly cosmos or the use of rational experimentation to show how it works. It isn't about scientific discovery at all, but rather divine revelation. Wright's inspiration was the true story of a German alchemist who discovered phosphorus, a magical substance which spontaneously combusts when exposed to air.
It might be worth actually putting our glasses on. As you'll see in a moment, this is really quite reactive. I'm going to take out a very small lump here. We'll reach in, and the phosphorus is stored underwater because that protects it from the oxygen in the air. Here is a small lump of it, and if you watch carefully, you may be able to see small wisps of smoke coming off it. Now, I've dropped it into this flask, and this flask contains pretty well pure oxygen. And we now are going to touch that phosphorus with a hot rod. Ready, steady, cook. The discovery of phosphorus is really a rather astonishing story. A German alchemist by the name of Hennig Brandt in the year 1666 actually took a large amount of horse's urine, which he stored in earthenware jars in his laboratory. Presumably, he wasn't a very popular neighbor to have. Once he'd accumulated enough of it, he boiled it down. So he heated it, and slowly evaporated away the water until finally at the end he would have been left with a rather sort of sticky mess down at the bottom. So he added charcoal to this brew and then placed the entire assembly, his entire flask containing this muck and the carbon, into a furnace and heated it. Now, at this point, something utterly astonishing happened. Suddenly, his flask came alive, and this incredible white glow, as we've just seen, would have appeared in the flask, and out of the alembic, out of the sort of neck of this flask, would have come drops of a bright, sort of flaming liquid. Wright, of course, would have really related the discovery of phosphorus to enlightenment quite literally. For Brunt, it must have been an incredible moment. No one would have seen anything like this happen before. He would have thought, you know, I've hit the jackpot. I've reached enlightenment.
The ancient art of alchemy gave rise to much of what we now think of as modern science, but it was fundamentally different. Though his laboratory looked similar, the alchemist was engaged in a spiritual quest as much as a scientific investigation. His ultimate goal was the famed philosopher's stone, that magical substance that could transmute earthly materials into the essence of divinity. However, for the most part, alchemists were treated with suspicion and derision. This is a much repeated image of an alchemist shown as a monkey. This is an alchemist being tempted by luxury. And this is a typical image of an alchemist in a shambolic laboratory.
The alchemist was usually a figure of ridicule, in rags because he'd spent all his time focusing on his work and neglecting his family and engaged in an entirely idle pursuit, a kind of charlatan. Apparatus would all be broken, you know, the image of the mad scientist, if you like, and someone who completely neglects their duties and neglects their moral duties too, because he's basically trying to take a shortcut to wisdom, if you like.
Because they claimed to be able to transform things, there were all sorts of opportunities for them to try and show off what they could do and to fund their practices and so on by gulling the rich. So one of the things that they could claim was that they might be able to make gold. And there's certainly all sorts of accounts of alchemists turning up, claiming to do something, showing off a few little fragments of gold at the bottom of a crucible, and then disappearing in a puff of smoke, or certainly not turning up after having been paid large sums by avaricious noblemen.
In the 18th century, most scientists were equally keen to distance themselves from alchemy because they regarded it as totally irrational. But Joseph Wright took a very different tack in his painting. He took it very seriously, drew up sketches and consulted his friends on how to portray the equipment in the lab. The final painting is an overwhelmingly positive image. Wright has painted his alchemist as a dignified figure, not a medieval quack. We see him kneeling down in reverence at his discovery, humbly acknowledging his moment of enlightenment. But why? Why did Wright want to portray alchemy in such a flattering light?
There is another tradition of the alchemist which is more respectful and indeed reverential. And this sees the alchemist not necessarily as somebody who is actually trying to find the philosopher's stone which will help transform base metal into gold, but using alchemy as a kind of image of spiritual or philosophical pursuit, the pursuit of wisdom, if you like. So the alchemist, scenes of alchemy aren't to be taken literally seriously, but they're taken as signs of the search for knowledge.
For Wright, it's as though alchemy offered a way to re-inject a spiritual dimension into a world where scientific rationalism had sucked out the spirit like air from a glass jar. His Alchemist isn't interested just in investigating the arrangement of the solar system or the principles of respiration. He has sought to go beyond mere understanding, to find the rapture of true enlightenment. Wright painted 3 proto-scientists, but ultimately the one he painted most flatteringly was the one who was least scientific.
Towards the end of the 18th century, a new mood arose. The key to civilization was not necessarily reason, which we associate with the Enlightenment, but feeling, empathy.
Is it right? Is it safe? Is it legitimate to unlock the mysteries of nature mechanically and in a certain sense with violence? Nature is better to be understood, as they would have said, as she is, on a mountainside, not in a drawing room.
Wright's singular journey through Enlightenment science has given us 3 virtuoso displays of painting technique. For that alone, they would be remembered. But they also provide a unique portrayal of shifting attitudes to science during a remarkable period of history. From the exhilaration of the early days to the doubts and questions of the middle period, culminating with the rejection of cold rationality. But in this final vision, Wright was far ahead of his time. The Alchemist was a painting which just wouldn't sell. He continued to work on it until 1795, when he was in his 60s and approaching the end of his career. By which time the world was a very different place. The confidence of the Enlightenment had given way to the doubts of the Romantic era. The brutality of the French Revolution had shown the dangers of asking too many questions. It might be rational to challenge the existing order, even the divine right of kings, but if that meant the terror and the guillotine, perhaps it was better to remain unenlightened. Science was no longer such a fashionable activity. Most professional lecturers had retired, and increasingly amateur scientists found themselves being pushed out of the picture by a new professional class, eager to forge ahead with their ideas, whatever the consequences. As for Joseph Wright, he had left his scientific painting far behind. The melancholy 30-year-old had become a clinically depressed widower. He increasingly found solace and comfort in landscapes, works that were no longer about mastering nature, but bowing down before it. Here in the Derbyshire countryside, Wright had found new subjects, far from the dark, claustrophobic rooms of his scientific paintings, in a place where the air was fresh and the birds could fly free.
More from the century that made us tomorrow as Andrew Graham Dixon tells the fascinating, sometimes scandalous story of how British artists made it from the gutter to the world stage. That's at 9. Tonight, masterpieces of the British Museum on the Assyrian lion hunt reliefs. Next.